In this event, we're going to remember our dear friend Peter. Not that anyone who spoke to him would ever forget him. It's easy to imagine how he would have reacted to the idea of this event. The mock sigh, the self-deprecating one-liner, the half-smile of pleasure. All of us who are reading, speaking, singing, playing, knew Peter and much admired him, as you all did. I'm going to mention a few aspects of Peter and make some links to the programme. Peter's extraordinary scholarship made a massive impact on classical studies. Nick is going to talk about the field of papyrology. In the field of Greek and Latin literature, Peter's presentation of brand new or recently discovered texts changed our understanding and enlarged it. The same is true of his and Hugh Lloyd-Jones's collection of Hellenistic fragments. You'll hear some examples of Peter's writing, and you'll see that his elegant style was already formed in his school days. Peter enjoyed things with vivid intensity. Food, wine, flowers, Bach, Mozart, Callimachus. Peter really cared about other people. He had an unusual ability to see things through their eyes without bringing himself into it at all. We're all witnesses of that. The last thing I want to mention is Peter's love for Barbara. Barbara also brought to him his beloved Italian family. The final piece of music will be a love song.
Eipetis Herakleite teon moron, esteme dacru egagen, emnes ten tossakis ampoteroi helion en leskei katedusamen, alla symenpu xein halicarneseu tetra palaispodie. Haide te aisdo usina edones, heisin hoppanton harpak tesa ides, uke picera palei. Patti adio parasema pereispodas, eumena oiden eidotos, eud oinoi, kairia syngelasai. Cretidam ten polymyton epistamenen calapaistein, disten taisamion pollaki tugateres, hedisten syneriton a eilalon, hed apobriste entadeton pasais hypnon a opelomenon. Teide sa un hodikonos acantios hieron hypnon koimatai, tneiskein melege tu sagatus.
The first obituary of Peter Parsons appeared in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, itself testimony to the international regard in which he was held. It began with a recollection of a Cambridge seminar in the early 1990s, crowded with the local classical heavyweights, including those not normally seen. That's a rather nice touch, I think. Peter held them spellbound, it goes on, as he pieced together a newly discovered poem of Simonides, one that transformed our view, not just of that poem, but of all Greek elegy. It was a masterpiece of scholarship, it says. The grasp of Greek language, dialect, and metre was superb, but there was also an intense feeling for poetry, and all delivered with urbanity, humour, and lightness of touch. And Peter's many friends will not be surprised. well have known or sensed for deep learning, and will recall with particular affection the humour and the geniality. His company was always a delight, and his own enthusiasms infectious, whether they were for music, for books, for films, for good food, or for good food, often cooked by himself. This is the man who could rise from the lunch table with a brisk achievement time, who could regret the disappearance from the meadows of the long-horned cattle, whose faces reminded me of so many of my colleagues, who, when discovered in the old Scala cinema watching an afternoon James Bond, could say, "Ah, so you too have a secret life." Who, when being teased about sending a late-night email, could pronounce, "The professoriate never sleeps." Who, in his inaugural lecture, could define the height of Western civilization as 29th of October, 1787, ceding, as he well knew, the puzzled conversations afterwards until the knowledgeable explained, the first performance of Don Giovanni. He even had the distinction of becoming an unseen in his own lifetime, for a passage from his Bodleian oration was set in a classics prelims Latin paper in the 1970s. In old age, he was as irrepressible as ever, limited by immobility to his Botley home, but always hospitable, with smoked salmon, gin and tonic, and, of course, as active on his papyri as ever. Above all, perhaps he was kind, such a kind man. He was kind with his time, kind with his affection, kind in sensing who needed them, kind in a way that radiated the warmth of his own feelings. And it was no coincidence, I think, that it was his support and friendship with Barbara after the awful death of her first husband that grew into something so much more. And it was terribly cruel that Barbara should have died so soon into their retirement, and many of us will remember Peter's own very moving and extraordinarily dignified tribute at her funeral. He was kind to me too over many years, but at 2 points in particular, when I was a new boy. The first was in the early 1970s, in my first time round at Christ Church as a senior scholar. Everyone's welcome was warm enough, but it was a bewildering place, especially for one coming from revolutionary 1960s Balliol, which, was really rather different. Peter was one of those who made it much less daunting. It was a time when the younger SCR members formed a close group of friends, almost a club really, and a year or so after my time, perhaps feeling slightly bruised at not being invited to some dinner or other, they decided to hold their own equivalent, and 2 of their seniors were invited as honorary youthfuls, Ron Truman and Peter Parsons, and I am not at all surprised. And the second was many years later, when, to use another Peter phrase, things had turned chair-shaped. First for Peter, and then on his retirement for me, and after me for Gregory Hutchinson. If I found 1970 challenging, after such a predecessor, I inevitably found 2003 much more so. His advice was gentle, but spot on. My introductory question could have been, admittedly, more tactfully phrased. Tell me, Peter, what is it actually that you do all day? But it was met with a smile and an hour or so of deep enlightenment. And what he had achieved as Regents Professor also made the job much easier and more enjoyable. By then, the faculty graduate seminars had lost many of the terrors of those of Edward Frankel. I remember those all too well. But he completed the process, and by 2003, they were much friendlier places, and graduates learned the more for it. Several have been in touch, recalling how much his individual encouragement meant to them. The Cambridge Regis Chair has a coat of arms. The Oxford one does not. Doesn't rankle. Not at all. But one wonders what it would have been for Peter. A papyrus in one quarter, certainly. A microscope in another. A musical stave, perhaps, in the third. And in the fourth, maybe a chef's hat. Or even better, that speciality of Christ Church SCR lunch that he enjoyed so much. A generous helping of Sussex pond pudding.
Peter wrote this as a teenager. On a sudden open fly, with impetuous recoil and jarring sound, the infernal doors, and on their hinges great harsh thunder that the lowest bottom shook, of Erebus. I hesitated for a moment, then, clutching my permit from the Ministry of Infernal Affairs, followed Mr. Milton, the ministry's official guide, under the huge gateway, and so began the easy descent to Hades. We heard ahead of us the roaring of a river, and at length emerged onto its bank. Some distance to our right, the stream vanished into the premises of the Styx Electric Company, but the only means of crossing appeared to be by ferry, always supposing we could reach it through the huge crowd which occupied the shore. My guide explained that this crowd consisted of those souls whose papers were not in order, and who could not be admitted until a quarantine period of 100 years had been fulfilled. So we pushed on, and, thanks to Milton's command of the gentle art of shouldering, soon reached the edge of the water. The ferryman, a most disreputable figure for a civil servant, accosted us very rudely, but the sight of my permit quelled him, and we entered the boat, which was so old and leaky that I commented on the fact. "But repairs," replied Charon indignantly, "are so expensive, and at least I've got an auxiliary motor. Besides, this is a boat of historical interest. If you look, you can see where Aeneas carved his name on one of the benches." With that, I had to be satisfied, but the journey was soon over, and after paying our fare, we set out again. The ministry's own watchdog, with heads appropriately in triplicate, tried to bar our path, but Milton contemptuously threw him a cake of red tape, which he snapped up in a single bite. Soon he fell asleep, and we proceeded. At last we reached the palace of Pluto, one of the stately homes of Hades, which the ministry had taken over at the time of nationalization. It was now the department's underground headquarters. Here I left my permit in official hands. Then the two of us set out for the Elysian fields to accomplish the object of my descent. We found the man I sought in that part of Elysium called Poets' Corner. On the pleasant green sward, bards of all nations were feasting and chanting their works. Shakespeare, of course, was drinking English-brewed ambrosia at the local inn. Ovid serenaded yet another lady-love. We avoided Tacitus, engaged in cutting out every second word in his latest work, and Aeschylus, occupied in a skirmish with Euripides, and we made our way towards the great Mantovano. He greeted Milton as a kindred spirit, and when he had heard my request, welcomed me as a humble disciple, for I had come through the awful realms of the Styx solely to hear him expound his philosophy of life and empire, as contained in the 6th book of the Aeneid, lines 724 and following. And expound he did. But the sun was warm, and the grass was soft, and he talked of the heaviness of the body, and I must have fallen asleep. When I awoke, his face was purple, and his voice had risen to a shout. I realized he was approaching a climax, and sat up hurriedly. The voice boomed out, "These, Britain, shall be thy arts, to keep the peace, to obey thy betters, and humble the upstart." Milton shook his head. "He's been offered a job on the Ministry of Propaganda," he explained in a whisper. The exposition was over. The great bard wiped his brow and called for refreshment. My guide declared that it was time to go, if we were not to transgress ministry regulations. Virgil suggested that we should go by the ivory gate of sleep, but Milton insisted that the lift was quicker. Facilis ascensus averno.
Peter, the papyrologist. Peter's research interest in the list of members of the sub-faculty over the years were two: papyrology, Greek literature. I'll take this as a goblet to discuss in a few minutes. Greek poetry was at the start of everything. Peter begins his book, City of the Sharp-Nosed Fish, with his schoolboy fascination with the symbols of the Greek alphabet and the discovery that, I quote, with some grammar and a dictionary, it was possible to make sense of the high poetry encoded in the symbols, unquote. Then came papyrology, and as he said, his introduction to it was a lecture by Lloyd Jones in which he dwelt with relish on all those boxes stuffed with the treasures of Oxyrhynchus. A year of study with John Barnes, the first person who actually trained papyrologists in Oxford, was followed by another year at Michigan with Herbert Utey, who was the leading papyrologist of those years. Peter spoke very little of his time at Michigan, but he mentioned more than twice, I think, something that Utey confided in him later, that he had spent a sleepless night agonizing over how to tell Peter that his first piece of work was, say, capable of substantial improvement, how gently he criticized him. Now, I don't know if it was due to Utey. He was definitely a very kind man. Peter's criticism was always very gentle, and this is something that several of you can testify. Even his views on others were very, very guarded, and if he ever said something harsh, it had to be treated in confidence. While at Michigan, Peter received a letter that he was appointed a university lecturer in documentary papyrology. It was a job created for him and for which he hadn't applied. He left Michigan with unfinished business, including a doctorate, about which he never spoke. Oxford offered more fun at that time, and in a radio program of 2002, he said that one of the greatest pleasures in life was to open a box of unpublished papyri without knowing what you will find. It doesn't mean that the end is not going to be met with disappointment. In one catalogue of a box with hopelessly fragmentary stuff that he produced, at the very end he wrote, like a medieval scribe, Laus Deo. Glory to God. Peter's introduction to the wider world was the Papyrology Congress of 1965 at Milan. He spoke of Philip the Arabian in Egypt, a paper published in JRS in 1967, where he argued that there was a reform in the administrative structure of Egypt in the 240s, and this view has now become a consensus. This article reflects something that he tried to impress in his teaching and writing, that documentary papyrology goes hand in hand with Roman provincial history. I mean, so far, it was all documentary papyrology and pretty much nothing else. But in 1971, we see the first foray into literature, a paper published under the title A Greek Satyricon, a text from the stock on which Petronius drew. Now, this papyrus combines what mostly interested Peter in any language: middle to lowbrow narrative and verse from high to low. Then in 1974, Peter produced volume 42 of the Oxyrhynchus papyri single-handedly. There were new texts of poetry and prose, as well as a feast of documents, with a range from the low-life world of the indistant proposal to the highest echelons of imperial Rome. Within the panorama of Bioxy, this volume picks up a thread left loose since the time of Arthur Hunt. Here we have someone, Peter, at ease with all sorts of texts, literary and documentary, and with a combination of interest and competence not shared by any of the other distinguished forerunners: meter, paleography, and even law. Hunt was a papyrologist, one of the best who ever lived. Peter also resides in the Pantheon. He didn't have the breadth of Hunt's output, But you had something else in addition, a depth in one of these spheres. In a well-known passage from Turner's Greek papyri where he describes what a papyrologist do, he says that the papyrologist's proper and professional field of competence is in relation to the texts themselves and what they say. In other things, such as Greek literature, Roman history, law, etc., he will be an amateur. Turner's views apply to most papyrologists, not that there were ever very many, but Peter, no. I mean, that's definitely not the view of whoever advised Her Majesty, Her late Majesty, in 1989 on the Regis chair. Bioxy 42 turned out to be the end of Peter's first phase. He moved away from documents. Udi would turn in his grave, he told me once, about this change in research focus. Now it was all high poetry, on papyri, but not necessarily from Oxyrhynchus. 3 articles published in quick succession in ZPE in 1977 showed someone who appears to have spent all his life working on Greek literature and nothing else. And these are the Oyster, Callimachus Victoria Berenices, and the Lils de Sicorus. There was also the sensational Latin discovery of the elegiacs of Cornelius Gallus, published in a synergy in 1979. There followed the massive Supplementum Hellenisticum, 1983, and then finally he goes back to Oxyrhynchus. Someone would feel proud, fulfilled, content with the epigrams and the elegy that need not be Hellenistic, published in 1984, the Simonides on Plataea, 1992, well, Menander, 1994, Nicarchus, 1999, or even the Hellenistic epigram Incubates, published in another synergy in 2015. But that's not all. Already from the late 1990s, poetry was not at Peter's forefront of interests. There was, of course, the book, The City of the Sharp-Nosed Fish, written over the years in fragments of time and completed under unhappy circumstances, and perhaps as, in part also as an antidote to those unhappy circumstances. And then the other old friends, novel, romance, or coffee table historiography. Even documentary texts came back with an impressive miscellany published in Bioxy 85 in 2020. Peter's research progressed like a kind of ring composition. The ring is now closed at about the same point where it started: middlebrow, narrative, and documentary papyri. Peter did not want a grave, but left something close to an epitaph in his self-description for the London Review of Books. Peter Parsons is a serial papyrologist and author of The City of Sharp-Nosed Fish, about Greek lives in Roman Egypt.
There is little about Peter's scholarly life that is not known to you, and known to you better than to me. But I would like to say something about a little less known aspect of Peter's scholarship, and that is his surprisingly close interest in what we now call popular culture. When I came to Christchurch in 1970, I still listened to the BBC weekly hit parade, an increasingly feeble attempt to stay in touch. One of the hits of that period was a remarkable song called "I've Got a Brand New Pair of Roller Skates, You've Got a Brand New Key." No one really knew what that meant, but it was in its own way a compelling song and very popular. To my surprise, I discovered that Peter was also one of its admirers, and that he also fairly conscientiously listened to the hit parade. I further discovered that he was pretty well informed about popular films, TV, changing fashions, and what became the world of Hello and OK magazine. He was, however, not interested in sport, I suspect, except surreptitiously, which he despised, or said he despised. I once induced him to watch the men's singles final at Wimbledon on television, and it was clear from the beginning that he was more interested in who was in the royal box and why they were there than what was happening on the centre court. He couldn't resist clickbait on YouTube, whether it be a wedding in the French ex-royal family, or the rituals of the Austrian Habsburgs when they buried their dead, or the many travails of the modern Spanish monarchy. In one sense, it was their vanity and occasional absurdity that amused him, and I should say that this was one of the few aspects of Peter's intellectual life that Barbara, who was no lover of monarchs, had doubts about. In another, he had a Weberian interest, Max Weberian interest. And I should say, it's probably widely known, that one of the things he had hoped to do and never was able to do was to write an extensive study of Max Weber and Roman Egypt. Unfortunately, that never happened. In another, he had a Weberian interest in the way predominant or once predominant elites presented themselves and the way they asserted or attempted to assert their authority. As archaeology advanced and Peter became more housebound, YouTube and Netflix opened new fields. Interminable but engrossing Spanish TV serials, Brazilian soaps subtitled in Vietnamese, and I'm not joking here, hitherto unknown Polish films. Channel 4 provided Walter Presents, and I think Peter was ahead of the game in his admiration for what came to be called Scandinavian noir. It was the quirkiness, the oddness, but also the everydayness, the familiarity of people's lives in the serials and the soaps that attracted Peter. He was, of course, aware that in the papyri, he was reading a literate class, and not exactly the story of every man. But the papyri are the domestic serials of their time. The mother who worries that her son is not doing his homework as he should, and thus will not get into the civil service. The wife who is cross because the cleaner has mucked up her husband's cloak. And central to the plots of all soaps and serials, the disputes with the neighbours over property and unpaid debts. Which brings us to the city of the sharp-nosed fish, as Peter introduced its inhabitants to us. Letters like these bring ordinary Oxyrhynchites vividly to life. Many private letters survive from ancient Greece, and especially ancient Rome. But by and large they survive because written by great men and collected after the writer's death by his admirers, so with the uncombed correspondence of the orator Cicero, or by the self-admiring writer during his own lifetime, as with the smug, stylish epistles of Pliny the Younger, lawyer and administrator. Greek Egypt offers something uniquely different. A huge random mailbag of letters to and from small people whose names have not otherwise entered history. We possess no portraits of Aculas or Serenos or Didyme or Apollonius or Serapius. Even their gravestones have vanished. Yet through their letters, we still hear them speak.
I joined Christ Church as a research fellow in October 1981. I'd only met Peter Parsons a couple of times, quite briefly before then, but it was already clear to me that his presence would be one of the most positive things about being at Christ Church. At that time, I had no idea that I would be spending the rest of my career in this college. As a result, for many years, I had the privilege of living a few hundred yards from his rooms, working closely with him in teaching, sharing the joys and frustration of faculty and college business, and my admiration and affection for him constantly grew. In these brief remarks, I can only offer a few memories from a friendship I will always treasure. I remember my first term as a tutor and the very first meeting with the freshers. I'd been through the usual routines about the syllabus, the lecture list, etc., and we'd got to the point of assigning work for the first week. Peter was there and started handing round black and white photographs of a papyrus. This, he told them, was a passage from the Iliad, and their first task for their next meeting with him was to determine which passage it was and take note of any differences they found when they compared it with a standard text. The freshers looked a bit bemused, and one of them piped up with the question, "Is this sort of thing relevant to what we do in mods?" Peter's response, "Aha! There's a man with his eye on the ball." Well, put it this way, it's good training for your mind, mods is good training for your mind, therefore it is relevant to what you do in mods. Not having yet studied the logic paper, the students subsided. But I think we can all imagine some other lofty tutors who might have given a rather different style of response. Gregory has written a tribute to Peter, and he said there, words echoed by Chris in his contribution today, that the first word that comes to mind whenever people talk of him is kindness. It showed at every level, in the generosity of his help to colleagues, to pupils, not least young graduates, and to friends. His tact and sympathy with those in difficulties were long remembered. After kindness, what qualities would we think of next? Intelligence, of course, and wide culture almost go without saying. And who could fail to pay tribute to his quick wit and his sense of fun? One small example. He and I were both born in September, 20 years apart. In 1996, I organised a party to celebrate a joint 100 years. He and I went in to order wine in the SCR, and I explained to the butler that the party was to mark the fact that I was 40 and Peter was 60. Peter interposed, "Admit it, you would never have guessed it that way round." But his wit was more evident still in the inimitable way he wrote, perhaps most dazzlingly in the long series of reviews he published in the London Review of Books and the TLS. Titles and opening sentences were eye-catching. Openings: "It takes a true patriot to love Roman Britain." Or, "Papyrologists are the bag ladies of scholarship." Titles: "Eels tomorrow, but sprats today." "How do Babylonians boil eggs?" He had a keen sense of the absurd, including the absurdities of academic taste and fashion. The cultural revival known as the Second Sophistic is described as having swept the empire in a tornado of hot air. The dubious status of the ancient novel is demonstrated by the fact that, quote, "the Emperor Julian carefully excluded them from his reading list for embattled eggheads," end quote. His work on social history through the papyri had sharpened his eye for the practicalities of Greek life. I quote from one delightful piece: "Athenian society looks oddly familiar. Barmen gave short measure. Tarts knitted between clients. Fishmongers threw water on yesterday's stock. Yet how can you enter into a culture which has no weekends and no refrigerators?" End quote. In the years before retirement and for some years thereafter, he was always a welcome companion at the lunch table and made an unmistakable figure stomping across Tom Quad in his thick blue pullovers and often eccentric ties. In meetings and in common room debates, he could forestall arguments and defuse tension with a well-timed jest. The genial irony of Peter Parsons could disarm even the explosive temper of certain senior colleagues. This humour and flamboyance masked a genuine humility, perhaps at some level a degree of insecurity. A man of extreme sensitivity and sympathy with others, he could be easily hurt, even if he might laugh off a critical comment in public. I remember that he remained downcast by a sarcastic remark from a transatlantic pundit, which others would have dismissed and forgotten. And although his career was one of dazzling distinction, there was, of course, sadness and loss as well. He found love late, and the happiness he and Barbara enjoyed together was a source of delight to those who knew both of them. But in 2006, she succumbed to cancer, and Peter had to soldier on alone. He found consolation in his work and in his many friends. The little house in West Oxford was a magnet for visitors from all sorts of places who came to consult or converse with the Buddha of Botley, another of his wonderful phrases. In one of our last meetings, he told me how he'd recently welcomed the man responsible for translating The City of the Sharp-Nosed Fish into Japanese. It was utterly typical that Peter insisted on the translator autographing his copy rather than the reverse. He knew that he was good at what he did, but he was always ready to admit that others had exposed errors or could see things that he did not. And indeed, he could correct himself. Some of you were present at what I think was his last public appearance, a paper given in the seminar organised by Daniela Colombo and Lucia Proustiello, and it's a delight to see both of them present today. Speaking from a wheelchair, in a sparkling paper delivered with supreme lucidity, he expounded the complex process of reconstructing a key passage in Callimachus's greatest work, and ended by refuting and improving on the text that he had himself offered in one place in 1977. He spoke out for papyrology and its achievements, and as we've heard, he continued his dedicated service to the Oxyrhynchus project long after retirement. Yet he was hesitant about making bold claims, still more reluctant to blow his own trumpet. Nevertheless, he recognized the need for someone holding so distinguished a chair to play a prominent role, one that went beyond the conduct and supervision of research. He served as Director of Graduate Studies in Classical Literature and also as Chair of the Lit Hum faculty during difficult times. And there were occasions when he spoke out for the subject. He would have dismissed with an amiable scoff the idea of his being anything like a public intellectual, but he was an eloquent publicist, all the more effective because everyone knew that his advocacy was rooted in profound learning. I want to end by quoting a passage from one such public statement, an article entitled 500 Years of Greek, which was published in the Oxford Magazine in 1992, a few years after he was appointed to the Regius Chair. Some of the comments, though couched in the terms of the time, seem all too relevant today when humane learning is still more imperiled. So these are Peter's words. As to the longer future of Greek, we can only acknowledge the dangers. We may envy the humanists. They had enlightened governments on their side. We do not. But that is no reason to give up the argument. It is true we fit uneasily in our world between old-style Philistines and new-style Puritans. We cannot worship the twin idols of microwave man, the cult of the easy and the cult of the useful, maximum pap for minimum effort. We cannot bow down to the idols of the new zealots, who regard the classics or the very idea of a classic as inimical to salvation. We shall get nowhere by arguing in the enemy's terms. We need to insist on simple truths. We do not teach Greek because it makes good computer programmers. We teach it because it increases understanding. We do not read the Greeks because they are dead, or because they are white, or because they are European, or because they are male. We do not read them because they used to be canonical. We read them to encounter an alien culture face to face. End quote. If the study of ancient Greek, or indeed Latin, is to survive, as we all hope it will, we can do no better than to take as our inspiration Peter Parsons, humane scholar, inspirational teacher, and most of all, our dear friend. Well, as you see from the programme, I'm expected to continue standing here, so this is the transition to conclusion. And part of that conclusion must, of course, be for me to thank Gregory for beginning to organise this event, and I've been happy to share with him that process, but also to thank all those who've performed and spoken here today. But that concludes the more formal part of our commemoration of Peter Parsons. But we hope that many of you will stay for a little while, enjoying, it says here, the sunshine, and there might still be some coming back, in the quad outside and exchanging memories of Peter. And we shouldn't forget the needs of the body. After all, our friend's hobbies in Who's Who includes cooking and eating. The hour is not right for the Sussex Pond pudding that Chris mentioned earlier, but there are light refreshments and tea and coffee laid out in the glass-fronted room just across the corridor, the so-called exhibition space. So thank you all for coming. Finis.